Welcome to The Political Animals, a show where two political philosophers, one a right-wing radical, the other a left-wing heretic, come together to discuss the social, political and cultural issues of our day. I'm Jonathan Cole, one of those philosophers. The other is Holly Lawford-Smith. Holly, how art thou?
I'm just noticing you've got a new background today, Jonathan. No more basketball paraphernalia. It's good.
Yes,
I like it.
I wanted to keep it interesting for
Yeah.
viewers, given they have to stare at the same backdrop for 55 minutes. And since you brought it up, I have been until now recording in my son's room, hence the
That's the
basketball
change.
paraphernalia. I'm now in my wife's room, otherwise known as the living room. So this now
And is
reflects
this
her
little
aesthetic.
one over your shoulder, is that two skeletons having a kiss, or am I
Yeah,
just reading that wrong? Okay, cool.
it is.
Lovely,
It is
lovely.
one of her favorite pictures. Now, Holly, so far on this show, we've tackled some controversial topics. We've asked whether LGBTIQ is a political ideology. We've critically engaged decolonization, and in the last episode, we tackled white fragility and racism. So we thought we should probably do something safer this week, and hence we're talking about abortion.
So first question I thought we could start with is whether abortion, maybe I should say permissibility of abortion, whether you think it's a matter of science or a matter of values. Is it a empirical descriptive question or is it a normative question?
It's interesting to hear you say the question. Obviously, I knew about this beforehand, but I just realized that there are two ways to interpret that question. And
Okay.
one is to answer it as me personally, my own normative view. I actually took a more sociological lens, and so I'm going to answer it looking at the abortion debate. And my answer there is, having
Wait,
thought about this,
sorry, just to interrupt, do you mean your sense of how the debate plays out in terms of whether it's playing out as a science question or a values question? Okay,
yeah.
got it.
So my answer relates to my assessment of the debate and all of the individuals, organizations involved.
Yeah.
So I think it's, to me, clearly primarily a question of values, looking at the debate, although the way that those values are applied to ethical questions around abortion are clearly informed by the science. And the reason I conclude that is that the key variable, it seems to me, that explains the ethical differences on this question are very much in the values domain rather than the science domain, insofar as when you look at the key scientific knowledge relating to the process of conception, gestation, the fetal development, I don't actually see a lot of disagreement between the pro-life and the pro-choice. It's not like these two camps have a totally different scientific account of how conception occurs, the process of gestation. There isn't even, it seems to me, huge divergence over factual questions about key milestones like when quickening occurs and the fact that there is a point in the gestation where the woman starts to feel the fetus move, nor viability. It's not like the pro-choice says, well, a fetus is not viable until week 36, and the pro-lifers are saying it's viable at week 5. I think everyone agrees it's kind of 22 to 23 weeks with complications and some degree of unsurvivability, and then from 28 weeks, it's generally most fetuses. Now a baby will survive and the like. And so it seems to me very much that this debate, particularly the clash, is best explained by different values. And I think that's because the ethical implications of the scientific knowledge can be interpreted differently and can be weighted differently. And that's how I would explain the differences of the debate and try to bring the science, which is still involved clearly, into relationship with the values. But I think very much most people are making their decision based on values, and that's how they're interpreting the scientific facts.
Okay, and then maybe just to loop it back to you, so that's your assessment of what's at stake in the public debate. When you think about the question yourself, do you go to certain empirical matters for your view, or do you too kind of agree that the thing that's really like the thing that you would want to settle to get to your own view, or the thing that indeed you have already settled if you have a firm view, would be a kind of values or theological question.
Mm. I mean, the way I think just in general is I always start with the empirical. So I look to find as much relevant data as I can. So I actually have some sense of the phenomenon that I've then got to analyze ethically. But then I'm immediately once I've finished laying out what I believe to be the data, and I'm generally going guided by experts on this because I'm not an obstetrician. Then, of course, I have to go to values because, in my view, scientific knowledge and data is not self-actualizing or self-analyzing. The ethics arises from the application and utilization of scientific knowledge, which is a human endeavor, which invariably involves some kind of decision making, which there always is with scientific knowledge, because there's always the option to not apply and utilize a particular knowledge. So, yes, I'm very much in this camp as well, but I start with the data. I think a lot of people start with the values, and then they pass the data in a way that tries to support the values. But what about you? How do you approach it?
Well, I just wanted to make a comment on that first, that because I think one thing that's interesting is that like the way that people approach the data can sometimes reveal that maybe it's just the values all along. Like someone might speak in a way that suggests they're really receptive to this question of like, well, when for example, would the fetus survive without the womb, for example? When is it viable? But then if it turns out that the answer to that scientific question doesn't suit what they want the political outcome to be, they'll shift to another empirical matter. And I think that can be quite revealing of what's really driving the disagreement. And maybe that's just to say there can be like a lot of layers to reveal what's really going on with people's positions. And I just think that's sort of interesting too. I guess I'm thinking about how the debate proceeds in philosophy, which tends to be in one of two ways. So a very common way is to take it to be a scientific question, but in the sense that you first think about what kind of trait matters. So when does a human have a right to life or a right not to be killed, or whatever, however you want to sort of think about that potential tension or clash between the pregnant woman's rights and the fetus's rights or interests. And so you might say something like, well, it's the onset of consciousness, or it's the onset of, like I just said, viability, when the fetus could survive on its own, or it's like when it looks enough like a little person or something that's like much earlier on. There's all these traits that you can name where that's the plausible candidate for who has a right to life, or has interests that would weigh heavily in this tension between the fetus and the pregnant woman. And then it becomes a scientific question of settling when that point is, of course. So then it's like, okay, turns out it looks like a little person at whatever it is, 6 weeks or something. That's just a guess, I don't know. And then that's the point where like abortion is impermissible after that. And that has led some people to think that like you can kill infants, right? Like, because sometimes you don't have the relevant trait of like self-awareness and reflexivity or whatever until after birth. So if you're really being consistent, you get all these weird results as well. But I'm just reflecting also, so that's kind of one common way things play out. But another way is just this kind of filling in of what it means to be a person. So then you've got this quite loaded, it's not necessarily a moral, maybe it is a moral, I mean, it's kind of in between, because certain sorts of rights and privileges attached to that concept. So the question then is more, when is the thing a person? And you can kind of like try to argue for that all the way back to conception, right? And so then it's just more about when this particular concept fits. It's not so much about when this material thing gains consciousness or whatever. And so a lot of debate also is about that, like whether and at what point in development the thing becomes a person and then has all the typical like rights and entitlements of a person. And I guess I am attracted, strongly attracted to the view that there is some point in from conception through development that the thing, I don't know how to say this, that the entity starts to be such that it will be continuous with its like 10-year-old and 50-year-old self. And that point, I'm pretty clear, is not conception. And so then I think for me, the thing that settles my perspective is a lot like, when is that point? And would it be possible to kind of build a policy around like taking that point seriously? So I guess that's to say, yeah, like mostly a scientific Christian in my view. But I think you're right. And it's interesting to note that like the way a lot of the debate plays out makes it more of a value question.
Yeah. No, you raised some very interesting things there, and I have a similar intuition. I mean, it seems, I think of the two extremes, and they reflect, I think, a problem with this specific 9-month period of human development and existence, and that is so much transformation occurs between the first 24 hours of conception and the last 24 hours. And so it's, are we clearly we're talking about the same entity, but even the language we use, like we don't, I did a bit of research, and like I think in that first 24 hours, the scientists would say we're talking about a zygote, which develops into an embryo, which at some point, I think around the 8 to 10 week mark, becomes a fetus. But then even that period, we use the language of fetus, a hell of a lot of change occurs. And if you take the two extreme positions, and thinking in particular of the most extreme pro-life and pro-choice positions, it seems very difficult to accept that the zygote, this like however long it is, like under a centimeter in the first 24 hours, could possibly be a person in any rational definition of what a person is. But similarly, to say that personhood begins outside the womb and that 24 hours before, what I think everyone intuitively understands is an actual baby, because it could quite easily be born a day early, and
well, some people say it's when you cut the umbilical cord, right? Because that's the first time that you've got a discrete individual. So that would be the far extreme of the view. It starts when it's its own entity, and that is post-birth, post-cutting the umbilical cord.
See, I think both of these views, because there's the one that life begins at conception, and therefore it should be treated as that first 24 hours is of the same moral value, has the same rights as you and I do as adult human beings. I feel like both sides collapse the complexity of that 9-month gestational period. And that's where this whole debate goes wrong for me. And I'm not saying I have the solution. It's an extremely difficult, because of the amount of transformation.
But why do you think it goes wrong there? Because I think it's a really useful observation that like both of those views seem wrong. Like it can't be that the day, like the hour before the umbilical cord was cut, or the day before birth when the baby could survive outside the womb. And it can't be like this weird thing about the cells. But doesn't that just show you somewhere in here, the 9 months, is actually the point at which the person begins? And then if we could just identify that point and make a plausible enough argument for why that's the point, then we could kind of just build all our policy around that. Like if a person starts at 6 months, then abortion could be permissible until up to 6 months. So why does it make you think that? Why don't you think that?
Oh, well, I guess I do. I was just kind of building on your idea that I think the problem with a lot of this debate is that the loudest voices, which are the most extreme, kind of flatten what should be a kind of multi-dimensional perspective of that 9 months. I think there are a couple of milestones which have been identified even in ancient cultures, like the Greco-Roman world, and also the Christian theological view right up until about the 19th century, understand that the quickening is a significant kind of moment, and that was considered a morally significant change in the ancient world and was reflected in the common law right up until the 19th century in many
And what
Western.
point is that roughly in the
I
timeline?
think that's roughly 18 to 20 weeks, if I'm
18
not
to
mistaken.
20.
I did put, I've got these figures written down somewhere, but I've got pages of notes. And I think another one is viability, where
Yeah,
clearly, and that it depends where you go, but I'd say it seems to be a consensus that at 28 weeks, most births are going to lead to a baby who will survive with little to no complications. I mean, it's more complicated. You can survive earlier, but the earlier you are, obviously, you can have very
yeah,
severe um, health complications. So let's just say, but it's not like we don't know whether it's between 10 and 38 weeks. So there is a point of viability, and that seems to be recognized in the debate. And then I think the other one, which you mentioned, is the ultrasound, which I think generally happens the first one about 10 to 12 weeks. And I think the sort of non-philosophical public has a
yeah.
natural intuition that
I
if
think so
you
too.
look at a picture of an ultrasound, it doesn't look like a blob. It looks like a human being in development because you
Right.
can make out the head and the arms. And so I think that for a lot of pregnant couples, based on some research I've seen, seems to be a significant thing that plays to their intuitions. And also there's some debate, well, not, there's a recognition in the literature that at the quickening, then often the parents, this could be the man as well, I've gone through this experience myself, that's when it goes from this kind of abstract thing that manifests in certain hormonal changes in the female body to, okay, can actually feel that there's something alive in here.
Yeah.
And as it goes further, I mean, you can feel or see the foot moving across and the like. So I don't know what else we have to go on, but this
Well, there's
speaks to
one
your
more
point
thing.
that it's not
Can I
like
just
it's a
add
complete,
one more point to
yeah.
this? Because now we've like the viewers have listeners have several like possible things to incorporate
Mhm.
as their point in that timeline, right? But I just want to add one more weird one from philosophy. So I've been teaching this topic, but in a metaphysics course, which is like study of what exists in the world. And there's this paper that I really like there because it is quite controversial in what answer it comes to. It's really concerned with like the personal identity question over time of like what's the earliest point in development such that you, like Jonathan Cole, could plausibly say that was you. And their answer to that comes out at 16 days, which is surprisingly early in the trajectory if we were going to want to tie abortion, or like if policy was tied to that, that would be well before most people would even know that they were pregnant. And their argument is that like the ways that the cells differentiate, that's the moment where you get the three-way differentiation that will eventually evolve into the like internal organs, external organs, skin, and so on.
Mm.
So they've got a very clever, like compelling argument for why that's the point at which you begin. But I've just always been really struck by how that's a great example of a scientific answer to the question that's quite unhelpful to policy, in the sense that like almost no women's rights activist or whatever is going to think 16 days is enough time for people to make like this
Mm.
very serious
Mm.
decision about their future or whatever. Sorry, I just wanted to add that one more
No, that's
option in
interesting.
as well.
That's interesting. And I just thought there is one other vital one we should mention, which is the pain question. And
Yeah.
from what I read, there's not a consensus exactly, but the sort of average figure is about 22 weeks is when the fetus is thought to be able to feel pain,
Which is relevant to the permissibility of the abortion or how the abortion is performed. Yeah.
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 Now, I think I can understand the attraction of the absolute views on both sides of this debate because it just strips out all the complexity. And as we've just articulated, it's like there are things you can point to, but it's like the answer is not obvious. And if you're going to talk about laws, then you have to get really concrete. But the interesting thing is, and this kind of takes us into our second question, Holly, which I might get you to articulate after I finish this entree into it. But I did quite a bit of research on the laws in Australia and the US across different states and in the Australian context, territories. And it seems that they often implicitly recognize some of these milestones. So in places where abortion is legal, there's usually a limit that seems to coalesce around either the upper or lower end of when quickening occurs or viability or pain. So in Australian context, it's as short as 16 weeks in the ACT, up to 24 weeks in Victoria, and somewhere in between. It's not that it's not that you can't get an abortion after that, but that's where the limit is set, where a woman can just walk into a clinic without having to give any reason. After that, it becomes more restrictive, and you need GP referrals and the like. So this is interestingly where I think we should bring in law into this, because it seems to me there is not a perfect alignment between the requirements of enacting legislation around abortion and the philosophical / ethical question.
Yeah, okay. Well, let me ask the second question, and maybe I just want to make two comments, I guess, of explanation before we talk about it. So the second question that I wanted us to discuss was, which is the harder question out of the ethical question and the legal question when it comes to abortion? And the first comment I want to make here is that I just kind of have in mind the parallel to the debate about sex work. So one question you can ask there is about the ethics of, say, you're a John and you're thinking about buying sexual access to a prostitute, the individual kind of personal ethics of your decision and what you would need to take into account to resolve for yourself that is indeed permissible. The parallel would then be to the individual woman thinking about whether it's ethical or permissible for her to have an abortion. Or, like in the sex work debate, the legal question for the state about what the right policy or law is when it comes to prostitution, criminalization, decriminalization, what's the other one? Legalization, or which kind of model, like the one that criminalizes the buyer but not the seller. So I guess I was just thinking, like, yeah, what's our sense of how this plays out in the abortion debate? And the other thing I want to flag here, I hope she won't mind, but is that I noticed that in some of the discourse about Moira Deeming, the MP that we've discussed in a previous episode, there's a real mixing up of her private or personal ethical views about abortion, which come from her, I guess, from her religion and her whatever broader ethical commitments. And people just tend to assume that because of her individual ethical position on this, she must want to legislate like all of Victoria to not be allowed abortion anymore. And almost no one appears capable of recognizing that she could have a personal view about what would be right for her, or she might counsel her friends in a particular way if they came to her for advice, but that's still an entirely separate question of what she would think an appropriate law is in a democracy where she's a representative. And I noticed that playing out so much in the last few years with all this pejorative, like, oh, she's a forced birther, as though she would want people to have like babies that they don't want. And so that sort of is why I was reflecting on this question of like, what's the hardest question, and can we sort of recognize that these are two quite distinct and separate questions?
That's a really fantastic point, and it occurs to me that this truth, which I actually think describes most people, is eliminated in the public discourse because the absolute voices are always the loudest, and they tend to elide the distinction between personal ethics and social ethics. And the interesting thing, and this did occur to me studying the abortion law, is there's no law I'm aware of on the books anywhere in the world today that compels women to have an abortion. So even once you have a legal regime that legalizes abortion, whether it's restrictive or permissive, there's still room for personal ethical choice. So one particular woman, I mean, it's easy to paint a scenario, and these are not theoretical. You have two women who have an unplanned pregnancy. They're in exactly the same situation. It might be a situation of hardship. One chooses to terminate the pregnancy. The other, perhaps because of their religious beliefs or their ethical perspective, decides to go ahead to term, even though knowing it's going to put them in hardship. So it's not like the law takes out all of the range of ethical responses and thinking, but you wouldn't know that from the debate because, and this is not just abortion these days, you can pick any social issue, activists tend to be unable to maintain that distinction, sensible distinction you spoke about. And as you know, I move in libertarian circles. This is really characteristic of libertarianism. The amount of libertarians I meet who say my personal normative view is X, but I think the
That shouldn't be the
law
law.
should be Y.
Yeah, I think that's great. Like I really think it's an important distinction. It would be helpful if there was more literacy about it. But maybe what you just said is helpful in the sense of also us recognizing there's a bigger problem that that private professional distinction, which might be relevant to earlier discussions we've had, like about DEI in the workplace and so on, right? And so too, then that like personal political distinction, it just kind of has been elided or collapsed in a lot of the discussions that are going on at the moment. And perhaps in part because of this idea from second wave and civil rights era politics that like the personal is political. I think that tends to get misread as like absolutely everything all the time is political and there is no other thing. And then so it's like, okay, whatever your view is your political view. And there could be no distinction of the kind that you've just articulated for the libertarians. Okay. Do we want to say what we think is the more challenging one? And then we can go on to
I've got a
question
pretty
3.
straightforward answer to that. Maybe you have a more nuanced answer, but I think it seems, I'm not a legal scholar, but I've been reading legislation since my career in the public surface, but the law doesn't seem overly complex to me. And looking right across multiple jurisdictions, there's a kind of coherent framework, like a band within which the laws all look kind of similar. So they all play on identifying a certain week. And like I say, there's a range of weeks, but they're all predicated on, where it's legal up to a certain week. And then, quite permissively in the ACT, it's even free actually up to 16 weeks. And then after that, it becomes a bit more restrictive. The regulation around it might differ, but it's the same principle. And then there's this concept of exceptions, which you get even in places, certainly in the US now, where abortion is illegal. There's no state that at least doesn't have the exception of protecting the life of the mother. So I would say the law is fairly straightforward. The ethical question, both for the individual, irrespective of what the law says, is way more complicated. So the law is predicated on the weeks, which seems to mirror those kind of issues we talked about in the first section, quickening or whatever. And then there's this concept of exceptions. And that pretty much seems to be it to me on the legal side. And I can't think of any other fancy legal regime you could employ here other than that. So I don't think it's complex legislation versus other types of legislation is what I'm saying. But I do think it's an extremely complicated ethical question because of the complexity of that 9-month gestational period, which confounds our conceptions of personhood, the human being, life.
No, that's interesting because I think I would have said the opposite. I see where you're coming from in sort of noting that like there's not that much variation between the different laws, and that suggests that maybe the fact that they've converged has some implication that they're sort of getting something roughly right. I think I was approaching it from, if I'm just in my armchair thinking about the question of what is the right law, that looks like a harder question to me, just because like democracy is hard and taking different people's competing preferences into account is hard, and dealing with topics where people feel so ferociously emotional and passionate about the thing is really hard. So maybe it's true I can make some sort of concession that like, well, but nonetheless, even when it's that hard, we've done a pretty good job actually so far. I think that might be right. But still, if I'm sort of thinking like, oh, say there was no policy or law and I myself was pregnant and didn't know what to do, which problem would I rather be tasked with solving? I probably, or sorry, yeah, which one would I consider to be the like harder or more arduous one that I'd try to get out of having to do? I think I would say that the law and policy one would be harder and more arduous. Okay, should we go into
Okay,
question
can I
three?
just say
I want to,
one thing in
yeah.
response to that? Because I think you really point to something very interesting that I hadn't factored into my consideration, which is even if I'm right, let's accept for the sake of argument, I'm correct that it's not a particularly complex issue to legislate. That clearly, and whilst you might be able to argue there's a kind of legal consensus around the right framework and paradigm, that hasn't then sorted out the social contention dispute, which really speaks to the fact that it is still a very complex, vexed
Still live,
ethical
yeah.
question. And the legislation, far from sorting that out, in some ways
Can
keeps fueling
inflame
it,
it.
as we've seen in America.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think that's a really important point that you made. But the next question that I think you're about to go to is an extremely interesting one,
Well,
Holly.
yes, here we are, a man and a woman discussing the matter of abortion. And I do believe some of my pals will want to know why I'm discussing abortion with a man, because a man should get absolutely no say in this matter. And so let's have a discussion about that in a way that might speak to some of those concerns. Like, should a man get to have any say in this issue at all, or is this a women's issue that should be kind of settled by what women want?
I mean, I'm just going to state this. I don't think we have time to go into it, but I'm really intrigued by the very notion that even discussing the topic with a man, a father no less, who has been with a woman from the conception right through to the birth, is kind of interesting, because that it doesn't follow that just because one doesn't follow from the other, it seems to me. But that's an interesting
Wait,
political, ideological question.
what do you think doesn't follow?
Well, I mean, you could have the view that the man has no say. I don't know why that then precludes you from actually discussing the topic, or why a man can't be involved in the conversation.
Sorry, maybe I should just flag here. I think the distinction probably is one between like an academic and a political right to have a say. And so it depends kind of what we think we're doing in this podcast. But if this is political, then the thought would be, why am I asking you your opinion at all? Why do I care what you think? And why do I expect our female listeners to care what you think? But if we are two academics discussing the like shape of the issue and its complications, rather than like your equal right to have a say on a political issue or whatever, then of course, like qua academic, you can. I think that would be the. I don't know if that helps you, but that would be the.
Oh, well, as you know, I mean, I'm kind of unoffendable, so it doesn't. It's not like I'm offended by it. Just found an interesting notion that maybe we can, once we do feminism or something on some occasion, we could tap into that. But going to the question, this is the way I've broken it down. The kind of 3 or maybe 2 points, no, 3 points. So I found myself asking, okay, what's the ideal for conceiving a child? And I think the ideal, and I'll explain why I think this is the ideal, is when a man and a woman in a stable, long-term committed relationship have a planned pregnancy with an intention to co-raise the child together. Because in that situation, which is how my wife and I had our baby, this issue doesn't rise because it's a consensual activity, right? So that's the ideal, but of course we don't live in an
Wait,
ideal
sorry, but
world.
whether you get to say, why do you think it's not an issue? If she decided she made a bad decision halfway through her pregnancy and wanted an abortion, of course it is
I'm going
still
to
an
come
issue.
to that's point number
No,
3.
but so why did you say it's not an issue? Because you decided together?
Well, yeah, we both wanted to have a baby together. We brought it to term and we're raising the child together. So
No, but that doesn't show that you get a say in whether she has an abortion. So what's the connection that you're seeing between you decided together and whether a man gets a say in the abortion issue?
I'm just saying in my view of the ideal situation in which children come into the world, which I think is actually the majority of cases, this issue of the man's right doesn't actually arise because it's a consensual decision together to have a family. It's not usually taken unilaterally. And abortion doesn't come into the picture. But I'm just saying that that's the
She could
ideal.
surely change her mind, right? I'm just getting you to
Well,
countenance that
I'm, go-
surely she could change her mind. And
I'm going to
then
come to
what?
that. I said this is just the first. The
Okay, it
first.
doesn't feel like a different point. It feels like this point is
Just
missing a crucial objection.
just
Go ahead. Sorry.
hear me out, and you can, even if you disagree with that first point, it won't matter once I get to point 2 and 3. So obviously, the ideal is not possible for all human beings. We don't live in the perfect universe, and I think then there are two situations that raise an ethical question, which is where there's a disagreement between the two parties to the pregnancy. And I think one case is relatively straightforward for me, and the other one, it brings us to the nub of this question. And the whole point of what I'm doing is, for me, I really narrow the scope down to one very specific situation. I think in the case where the father wants an abortion but the mother doesn't,
Hmm.
then I don't think the father should be able to coerce the mother, and this happens plenty of times, to have an abortion. I think that is actually her decision. I think she can unilaterally decide to give birth to the baby against the father's wishes.
Yeah.
Now, where this really does become an ethically interesting challenge is when the roles are reversed, where the father doesn't want an abortion and may have a conscientious objection to abortion because they're a pro-lifer or whatever, and the mother, for whatever reason, wants to have an abortion. Then the question is, what say, if any, should the man have? So the point of what I'm doing is I think this is really the only scenario for me where this question becomes really
Hard.
relevant and
Yeah.
and quite frankly challenging. And I don't know what the answer is to that, except to say that um, I think it shouldn't. I think it's quite clear. It's easy to paint a scenario, and I'm sure these happen, where the father would suffer a kind of trauma, particularly if they're a pro-lifer and they believe abortion's murder. And a situation where there's a change of mind, for example, even if you're not a pro-lifer and you're really looking forward to being a father and having this child, and if there's a unilateral decision and you're either not told or you're told you don't have a say, I can see how that would create some kind of psychological distress for the man, which in itself doesn't say what say the man should have. But what I'm saying is I think there is some harm suffered potentially when
But how are you thinking of that harm compared to the harm of someone carrying a pregnancy to term that they don't want?
well, yeah, I mean that this is why it's a vexed
But is
issue.
it
So
vexed like they're kind of weighted the same, or because we've talked before about psychological harms versus physical harms, right? And
yeah,
in that episode, you were very keen on physical harms being much more important. So
yeah,
now I would want to
yeah.
throw that back in your face and say, okay, who
No,
cares? Yeah, the man has a psychological harm, but
yeah,
the mum wins because that's her body. And
no,
pregnancy is extremely
totally,
painful and
yeah.
destructive. And like,
I have a consistent view. I can't think of a viable, feasible legal regime that could require the consent of the father. So I think, like in many cases in life, I think suffering's going to be there, and I think the law and the weight of social opinion is going to be with the mother in that case. I just find in the debate, like the very notion of the question whether the father should have a say, I'm saying,
yeah,
like, like I say, I've gone through this process, not abortion, but of like being a father, and uh, this idea that the father has no interest, is not involved, does not get attached to the fetus is
mm.
ridiculous. I've experienced it firsthand, and so
No,
I
I
can
see.
I can
You're just
understand
trying to say
how.
he has a stake, like he should have a say in whatever way we fill it out because of this psychological harm. It gives him a real stake in the outcome, even if we still
Yeah,
want to then go ahead and
yeah.
say that, like, ultimately it's the mother's choice or whatever.
I think ultimately, if we're talking about the law, you've got to make decisions in complex cases. I think it would be probably a greater injustice to insist that no abortion could occur without the consent of the father. I mean, and of course, it could be a child conceived in rape, could be a one night stand. You might not even, like, why should someone you don't actually are not in a committed long term relationship have any say over it? So, but all I'm saying is this is really a response to your friends. I mean, the idea that the man is not invested or emotionally uh, kind of has some kind of stake in the conception of a child. Might not be every man, but plenty do. And I just think, unfortunately, as in a lot of cases, they're going to have to just suffer.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the skeptical response that I would want to advance is like, I hope, or it doesn't seem implausible to me that like he has these really strong emotional feelings. And so you're right that there's a sort of psychological harm or suffering going on. But then it's like the number of men for whom they feel so strongly, and then the woman ends up like emotionally blackmailed into having the child, and then ends up lumped with like the huge and disproportionate share of the childcare and labor, or he fucks off after 2 years and then she's just raising the child alone. It's like, I don't know how much weight to give his strong sentimental feelings at the time when she's then got this like lifetime domestic labor burden that like she didn't even want. I think we would have to factor all of those like statistics of shitty dads or abandoning dads or not doing their fair share dads into the question of how much weight to give those feelings of his in the sense of what the outcomes should be. And I know not all men, but enough men even in Australia, because I've looked into this recently, that I would just want to say like, okay, let's not give too much weight to that attachment or feeling that he might have.
I mean, I think the issue here, which is something that I thought a lot about, which is also missing, and you could add a third dimension to that science values dichotomy, make it a trichotomy, because I think the circumstances matter a lot here, and we forget just what a wide variety of circumstances in which pregnancies occur, right? Like seems to me there's got to be some moral significance to the different circumstances of a 13-year-old rape victim who conceives versus a 35-year-old married woman who changes her mind. I'm not saying the law can
No,
be
I
so
know, but
nimble that it could
it's slightly
change it.
taking us away from the topic, right? Like the topic is, should the men get any say? And as you accurately said, I think the hard case is the case where there is a couple in a committed, loving relationship and they have these different views about what they should do with the pregnancy that was maybe unplanned. So we don't need to go all the way to the 13-year-old rape victim and whether her rapist should get a say. In this hardest case of the loving, committed couple, there's still a question, I think, of whether it's really true that the man's say is worth much, given...
Well, I'm saying the circumstances matter here as they do in all cases. That's why I thought of it, so that we both...
But why
I don't know if you
mention the rape
noticed.
victim? Like, what is that relevant to the question
Hear
about
me.
the man?
I don't know if you noticed, but we both gave a different scenario which illustrate the kind of range of spectrum here. So you talked about the father who doesn't stick around, the deadbeat, absent dad, and I think
But
the
that could
idea
be you, right? That could have been you. Like, you say, oh, we decide together, it's consensual, the issue doesn't arise. But imagine, like, you just got an amazing job offer in, like, Abu Dhabi or whatever. I'm just trying to think. Like, and then you just imagine some counterfactual version of you who actually does leave. That's possible, right? There are men like that. And then I'm
I know,
thinking,
but I'm saying there are also men like me and many others
yes,
I know.
agreed. I never said there weren't, but my comeback was like, given what we know about Australian dads, just empirically, surely that evidence has to feed back into this question of how seriously to take the man's sentimental attachment to the question of the child being murdered or whatever. If he's really caring about that and then not actually contributing, what is it called, child maintenance to the child for its entire life after birth, then I don't care that much about his sentimental feelings.
Yeah, although that's kind of a post-birth issue, but...
No, it's not. The question is, what stake does he have and what say should he get to have in the abortion or not? Those things about how he would deal with the child afterwards are relevant to the question of what say he should get.
Yeah, I totally understand. But what about the other side of the scenario? Or do you think there's never a situation where the father believes abortion is evil or whatever, where he wants to stick around, he's totally committed, and for whatever reason, it's irrelevant to the scenario, the woman doesn't want to go through with the term and decides to unilaterally terminate? Are you saying he should have no say or some say?
I'm not saying he should have no say. I'm making a point about what we know about dads in general being relevant to how seriously we
Yeah.
should weight his feeling. So I'm not denying that there are men like that. I'm just saying, should that man's strong feeling at the time determine her being emotionally blackmailed into having a child, given all the ways that that could turn out? Maybe not, right? Maybe it registers as something, but it's never going to be decisive. Like the decision, given the risks of how that child
Yeah.
rearing situation will turn out, the risks are so much more on her that she should make the ultimate decision.
Yeah. Final
Question
question.
4. Yes. I've when I've been reading around on this topic, occasionally you run into just like surprising or novel, whatever ways to approach the issue. And so I thought that would be a nice place to end. Like, what have either of us run into in the literature or out there in the world of ideas that we've found kind of compelling or helpful that we might want to like report back to our listeners?
Do you want me to begin?
Go for it.
One of the things I did in preparation for this was read the Roe v. Wade decision for the first time ever, and then read the Dobbs v. Jackson judgment for the first time ever, which I found really interesting. And something really struck me about the language in the Dobbs v. Jackson. This is the US Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. And I'll quote, it's like right in the last paragraph of the judgment. It says, "The Constitution does not prohibit the citizens from each state from regulating or prohibiting abortion. Roe and Casey arrogated that authority. The court overrules those decisions," and this is the key bit, "returns that authority to the people and their elected representatives." And as we all know, the situation in the US now is that each state has now a much more divergent legal approach to abortion, such that it's practically illegal in all cases, except for very few exceptions in about 11 states. And in other states closer to Australia, where up to a certain week you can get an abortion without, freely, with greater restrictions later on. And what I found interesting about this is the kind of logic underpinning it, which is this is a complex, contentious social issue.
Mm-hmm.
And now you could argue, and this seems to have been the court's view, is that the just settlement here is for majority opinion at that more local level through elected representatives to determine what the law is. So one way of construing the current legal situation in the US is that each state's law on abortion reflects to some extent the popular will of the people in that state. And of course, there's the ability for that law to change if the people want to vote out or elect people with a different view of abortion. And I found that interesting because it begs the question, which came up earlier in our discussion, is abortion fundamentally, and should it fundamentally be, an individual decision or the decision for a couple, depending on what you think? And I think often it is a decision taken by couples together. Or should it be a social decision where people who have never been pregnant, never had an abortion, have some say, and thus we weight all of their opinions? And I'd be interested to know what you think of this, Holly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it does pretty tightly connect to the last discussion, the returning. In principle, I think the idea of taking something from the federal level and returning it to the states so there can be more variation between states and the law can more accurately reflect what the people want, I think that's actually great.
Mm-hmm.
And it avoids the kind of tensions where you can end up with questions of secession, like between what's happened in Scotland, for example. But yeah, the problem with doing that with abortion, well, maybe that was the problem anyway at the federal level, but the problem with doing that with abortion is you are giving an equal say to 50% of the population that at least have less of a stake. And still, I can sort of see the argument, while still maybe we should just be fighting for social reform that gives men more of a stake so it is democratically justified. I mean, that would be, make it more difficult for men to avoid paying child maintenance rather than it's kind of easy now and loads of men defect on it. Or I don't know what other policy reforms would really help with that. Like there's been a wages for housework campaign in the past. Like maybe there needs to be some sort of social assistance for mothers that want to stay at home but can't afford to do that and rely on the dad for that reason, and so are dependent on bad debt. I don't know. Maybe there are social reforms we can make that would really help the family and help mothers. And then it would be kind of more okay that like everyone got to decide, even though some of those people would be very ignorant about the phenomenology and stakes of pregnancy and what's likely to follow it. Yeah, do you want to say anything more about that before I launch into my favorite idea?
Yeah. No, I share your attraction to let's just call it the legal principle, because it's not specifically an abortion principle, that greater decision making should occur at a more local level. This is the principle of subsidiarity. I'm very much in favor of that. And this is essential to how democracy works, isn't it? That generally majority opinion tends to carry the day on the majority of issues, and that's baked into our political system. Politicians, victorious parties use the language of mandate, and sometimes there are referenda and plebiscites, and we do all this polling. So there is this kind of interaction between the majority, and politicians are very sensitive to that, and it's, I think, popularly considered a legitimating aspect. I'm just conscious that majorities are capable of supporting evil actions. I think Hitler at one stage had popular support in Germany. I don't think the majority were opposed to his various wars of aggression across Europe. The Holocaust is a bit different because I think the majority of Germans were unaware at the time. So my one caution is, and I can see exactly how the pro-life and pro-choice camp are going to view this. I mean, given the stakes that they think are involved, the idea that the majority could legitimate murder, for example, or remove the bodily autonomy of women, I guess is going to be fundamentally unjust, even if 99% of people want to support it. But again, in the real world, I mean, is this more or less just? I actually think this is way better than Roe v. Wade, and it being a kind of federal law purportedly grounded in an inferred privacy right. I think this makes it much more explicit and clearer, and I think it makes the debate more legitimate, in that the people in a particular constituency, whether it's Texas or California, can express their will. And what alternative is there on a divided topic except to try and listen to where the weight of popular opinion is? But hit me with your insight or idea.
I happen to be reading, so Joel Feinberg has this Moral Limits of the Criminal Law 4-book series, and I was reading it for a totally other purpose. And I just came across this discussion that I really liked. And yeah, I guess it's just this thing, it's going to be different for every individual, but when you see something in a new way, or someone manages to say something kind of new about a very old thing. So I really liked it. But I went around Melbourne trying to tell other philosophers about how cool it was, and they all seemed really underimpressed. So I was like, okay, maybe it's just me.
Let's see if I'm impressed.
Let's see what you think and what the listeners think. He had been thinking about using dead people as crash test dummies. That was the discussion. It was about profound offense, so things that people just are really like shocked and horrified by, and thinking particularly about like the loved ones of the cadaver, I guess, that is used in these crash test dummy scenarios. And apparently you just get much better data that's really helpful for saving the lives of future people if you're using real bodies than like crash test dummies. So the discussion went from there. Anyway, so the parallel was thinking about the crash test dummy, thinking about the flag of a country and the way that a flag stands in for the nation, which is why flag burning is seen as really offensive by some people. It's like you're burning Australia in some sense. So the argument ended up being some things are symbols of things that we really care about or are important, but we should not conflate the symbol of the thing with the thing itself. So a flag is not a country, a cadaver is not an alive person, and crucially for our purposes, a fetus is not a person. And this goes back to the thing from our, I think, discussion of the first question you talked about when the ultrasound is done and the little thing really looks like a person. I think he's particularly interested in that stage. It lacks certain traits that we might think are crucial to personhood, but it looks like a person, so it's a symbol of a person, and all of our like emotional weight that we put on live real persons like gets attached to that thing symbolically. And I think what I found really helpful about this distinction and then kind of what he went on to do with it was that once you recognize that a thing is a mere symbol, it helps you get your priorities straight. So the cadavers, even if it might be quite shocking to family members, because they're doing so much good for persons and because they are only themselves a symbol of a person, you can prioritize, like it is permissible to use them in that way and prioritize the benefits to the living persons. And similarly, the thought would be when you have a real conflict between the fetus and the mother who is a real person and the fetus that is a mere symbol of a person, you should prioritize the mother. And from what I remember, he is quite sympathetic in the sense of like, that is a real conflict that people feel really strongly about and for understandable reasons. And the fetus looks like a person much more than the flag resembles a country. So the emotional parallel is really close. But nonetheless, like once you take that conflict seriously, you still kind of know where to weight things, because the thing you're really caring about is the person and therefore the mother. I found that very helpful. I don't know what you think. What do you think?
Really interesting. I would make two observations. One about the crash test dummy idea, one about the topic we're discussing. I would just note that I understand how you could view a cadaver as a symbol, but of course it's not a symbol for the family member. It is actually the body of the
But it's only
person
the body. It's not the person.
Yeah, but I'm not sure it's symbolic in the same way it is to you or I who don't know the person, because we know it's not a live person. And I think it strikes me that in the case of abortion, I think we both agreed that, whether we agreed or not, my view is that personhood does actually occur in the fetal development. And because of that, and although it's a hard line to draw, I would actually err on a pretty conservative side, which would be 16 weeks for me. Then we could talk about exceptions, but you have to make a judgment. If you think the person occurs before that last 24 hours, as I think we both did, you've got to make some decision about where the person is. I think what often happens in the pro-life movement is, and this does relate to your symbolic idea, I think they're often parents, so they've experienced the birth of a child, and so they see the potential life actualize. And so then I think with the idea of people terminating pregnancies, I think they're thinking of
the later
their experience of the potential actualize, because strictly speaking, they have no interest. They're not an interested party in these decisions. And so I think you could argue that they view the termination as kind of symbolic of their own family and parenting in a way.
Can I just say on the thing about where the point is, I think Feinberg's idea is still going to apply so long as the point at which the fetus looks like a person is earlier than whatever your point is. Say it's quickening, because the fetus will still be a symbol of a person up until the meaningful point at which you decide the person begins or whatever.
And it's complicated by this notion, it seems to me, of the life potential, and dealing ethically with potentiality is a very difficult topic. But was there anything you wanted to add to that whole symbolic picture?
No, and I think we're pretty much out of time.
Shall we wrap it up?
Yep.
Well, I think we did a good job. Thanks for listening or watching. If you enjoyed the episode, why don't you subscribe to the YouTube channel, drop a like, drop a comment. People are loving to comment, and there's some interesting discussions going on now. Shows, if you're listening on the podcast, and particularly if you're on Apple or Spotify, please consider giving it a 5-star rating. Holly and I are grateful for your attention, and we'll be back again shortly. Thank you.